his stories, his way of conceiving of the world, filters into your own and becomes a lens through which you see the world. I think of what is, for me, one of the dominant sensations of reading Tabucchi is the way in which reality and imagination become very hard to distinguish from one another, and in which, in fact, for him, they're kind of indistinguishable. One imagines the world as one lives in, and one lives in it, one imagines it, and that feeling was always present in his work in the early stories that I remember reading when I first met him, the Gioco del Rovescio, Piccoli Senza, things like that. And the thing that is striking in thinking back, as I'm thinking about our friendship after he died, was where did it all go? It was I met him when I was in my mid-20s, and he was probably in his early 40s. So I was very young, and he still just coming into, I think, the fullness of his powers as a writer, with much of his best work ahead of him. We might have actually physically met maybe 6 or 8 times in 30-odd years, which isn't terribly much. And so there's this weird sense of decades going by between one meeting and another, and yet there was, I don't think it was just my imagination, but there was a real friendship there. He would always send me all of his books as they came out. He would occasionally call me from Lisbon or Paris. I really called him partly out of the shyness of being a younger writer, not wanting to bother an older, a very established writer. But it obviously meant something, and yet when I think about it, it's just all, and there was always the sense that that there would be a time in which we would be in the same place for a prolonged period of time, in which our friendship could really fully develop. In some ways, it was a kind of imaginary friendship, a friendship that had somehow nourished itself through, at a long distance, through our mutual imagination, because there was always a great warmth and closeness and same kind of playfulness and warmth to our encounters, even though sometimes there might have been 10 years between one and the other, which was, so it was really a friendship conducted through the imagination over time. And yet, I found myself thinking about this little friendship, hardly a major relationship, I suppose, in either of our lives, but not without significance. In reading this lovely volume of stories that we're presenting today, because I felt somehow our friendship could have been a little story of this kind, in which one of the things that happens to many of the characters in this book is that time sort of sneaks up on them, and the characters are suddenly aware that things have gone by without their quite knowing that there's a woman in one of the stories, in the first story, I think, who suddenly, it suddenly dawns on her that she and her husband have been married for 20 years, they haven't had a child, and it may be too late. And so that sense of time sneaking up on something that particularly I was aware of when I saw Antonio when he came to New York, and I think around 2008, 2009, we saw one other couple of times. He was teaching at Bard, and in New York a certain amount, and he was already suffering from rather bad back problems, as one of the characters in one of these stories suffers from, and he said in a kind of joking, lighthearted way, he said, suddenly I became old. I think it kind of snuck up in him that he was suddenly now aware of his mortality and the quickness of the passage of time, and the sense for me that there was this incomplete story of a friendship that didn't have a chance to develop more fully, that somehow should have developed. And one feels in a lot of these stories and a lot of his work that because the relationship between the reality and imagination is often indistinguishable, that there are all sorts of potential outcomes in these stories. In one of the stories in particular, he explores different ways of ending the story, and you're not sure. So is this the narrator who's imagining the end of the story? Is this what happened? That's kind of the way I think life in Tabucchi's world was. And so what I think is perhaps a tribute to him is that I think about our particular little friendship. I feel like I might be living a story by Tabucchi because he's imposed his imagination on me, in which we've experienced it. I thought maybe in that spirit I flagged a few passages as I was reading that I think expressed a bit about of that spirit, and I thought I might share a few with him before passing over to Mark and to Antonio. In this story that I mentioned, where the female narrator is reviewing her life a little bit, where she's had this sudden realization that time has passed and perhaps the time for her eternity has come and gone. But then she has this moment which is very, what I think one feels and experiences in many of these stories is that despite this sense of time creeping up on you, there's also the kind of fundamental mystery and inexplicability of existence itself, which hits these characters in certain ways, and which he manages to render very beautifully in his writing. So as I said, after she's had this kind of realization, she then is looking at a scene where she sees some horses, and I just thought I'd read a little bit from that. Meanwhile, the horses were circling ever faster, fast like her thoughts gone circular, a thought that thought itself. She was aware only of thinking she was thinking, nothing more. And in that moment, the leader of the herd, in the same sudden way he'd drawn the circle, now broke it. With an unexpected swerve that seemed to defy the laws of nature, he slanted off, dragging the whole herd behind him, and the horses galloped away. She stood there watching the shimmer of the straw specks raised in the dust as they glinted in the sunset. She thought she should keep thinking of not thinking of anything. She sat down and scraped the grass stubble. Searching for the ground, the sun was disappearing in the orange light already held hints of indigo. Up there, the horizon was circular. It was only the thing she was able to think. The horizon was circular. It was as though the circle drawn by the horses had expanded to infinity, transmuting into the horizon. And so you see that kind of play in which her thoughts and the horses all become kind of mingled into thinking about thinking. That I think is a very kind of Tabucchian moment. Another particularly affecting story for me, because the protagonist is clearly, at least in part, drawn on Tabucchi himself. The protagonist suffers from excruciating back pain and is visiting an aunt in the hospital. And one of the things that's quite affecting and quite beautiful in the story is that as the aunt, who is on a morphine drip, is sort of in and out of consciousness, in and out of, wants to say things to him in her moments of lucidity and wakefulness, and in which the character is almost unsure whether her memories are mingling with his memories, and she draws him into remembering things that he had long forgotten from his early life. I'll just read a little passage that reflects that. In that silence, he listened to her murmuring in his ear, leaning forward. Curiously, his back pain had ceased, and behind that feeble voice he found he was navigating in a self he'd lost, back and forth like a kite twisting on a string. And from up there, from that kite on which he was seated, he began to discern a tricycle, the voice of an evening radio broadcast. A Madonna, everybody claimed, was crying. A little girl from a displaced family with bows in her braids. Who is she? Hopped on a chalk pattern on the ground, exclaimed, "Square Run, bread and salami," and other things like that. The aunt by then was talking in the dark, since even the dim overhead light had been shut off, and only the pale blue lamp over the bed remained, and a glowing slice of neon coming from under the door. She closed her eyes and fell silent. She seemed exhausted. He straightened up in the chair and felt a sharp pinprick of pain between the vertebrae. She's fallen asleep, he thought. Now she's really fallen asleep. Instead, she brushed his hand and beckoned for him to come closer again. Ferruccio, he heard her breathe, saying, do you remember how beautiful Italy used to be? And so you sort of see her drawing him into her mental life, and then she seems to pass into sleep and then out of it, and then comes up with this unexpected comment, which has nothing to do with what they've been talking about really before. And this moment also, if you remember how beautiful Italy used to be, something we were talking about before tonight's presentation was Tabucchi's political life and commitment. He was really a literary man in his formation, professor of Portuguese literature, a great lover and great translator of Fernando Pessoa, but was kind of drawn into, as many of us were, into a kind of political commitment during the period of reign of Silvio Berlusconi, and he ended up taking some strong public positions for which he was strongly attacked, and that is somewhere in the mix of this. And in fact, in some of these stories, there is a strong moral, ethical component that sneaks into things. In one of the stories, for example, there is the story of a guy who clearly worked for the East German secret police and spied on Bertolt Brecht, one eventually figures out by the end of the story. And yet it's a sort of funny thing where this member of the Secret Services is nonetheless a character of Tabucchi, so that at the end of it, he realizes that while he spent his life observing and spying on other people, he's himself been spied upon. And so, again, it's not clear. So who is he? Is he the person who observed others, or is he the one who's been observed? And he's there in the cemetery visiting Brecht's grave, and he's sort of caught in a very Tabucchian moment by a butterfly that's flying by. It gets him thinking about the past, and he says, I know everything about you. He's obviously speaking to Brecht. The butterfly disappeared beyond the trees, and he lowered his voice. I know everything about you. I know everything about your life, day by day, everything, your women, your ideas, your friends, your travels, even your nights and all your little secrets, even the tiniest one, everything. He realized he was sweating. He took a breath. On the other hand, I didn't know a thing about myself. I thought I knew it all, but I didn't know a thing. He paused and lit a cigarette. He needed a cigarette. It was only 2 years ago when they opened the archives that I discovered Renata had been betraying me all along. Who knows why? It suddenly occurred to me that even I might have a file like everyone else. It was a complete file, detailed, of someone who'd been spied on every day. The item relatives was a whole dossier with photos taken with the zoom lens, and so on. So you get this thing of this character who suddenly everything is turned upside down. It's very much a Giorgio and Rovescio over again from those early stories of Tabucchi. So I could read on, but I don't want to drag out the whole evening. So I'll maybe turn to Martha and just going to talk a little bit about her experience as translator and the particular challenges of translating a writer who often destabilizes the reader and therefore perhaps the translator, in which there are different levels of reality and stories within stories.
You're absolutely right. There are different levels of reality, and of course I'm not the translator. I'm one of two.
Yes.
We worked as a pair here, and we spent a lot of time talking about how these stories landed on us linguistically and emotionally, and that landing was different for Antonio than for myself, obviously. So the first thing we had to do was just read the stories aloud a lot, talk about the music of them. You could hear from Alexander's reading the onrush of these sentences. They're very propulsive. They're punctuated mainly by commas. They just go on and on at some length, and they gather energy and meaning and complication as they go. And we had a lot of tricky decisions to make about syntax, about the order of sentences, whether to reverse things, keep things as they were. Our editor, Jill Schoolman, who's here from Archipelago Press, was wonderfully helpful for us in just sort of serving as our interlocutor, saying, you know, let's think about this as an English sentence, let's think about what the Italian was, how do we preserve that strangeness that's so attractive in Tabucchi. The stories are obviously connected by the notion of time, and as Alexander said, people find themselves with time sneaking up on them, time messing with them in various ways, and they mess with it. Memory and conjecture are sort of key words in these stories, and so the way that time operates in people's lives can't be separated from the way that they remember and the way that they guess at what's going on with them. And some of the most moving passages happen when, as in The Circle, someone is just caught up short and realizing that the way they thought they had their hands on the reins of time just wasn't working any longer. We struggled, as I said, a lot with syntax, but also these stories and their narrative strategies are really kind of strange in that you'll often just be plunged right into the middle of a story. And we puzzled too, because in Italian there's lui and lei, him, her. There's a way that pronouns give away gender that made us have to decide whether we...
Or you don't need
or where you don't need to in Italian, that there are other ways to signal what gender is than pronouns alone. There's also, of course, the endings of adjectives that will give away whether you're talking about a female or male. So we had to have complicated discussions about whether to tip it early to make it clear who a particular character was, or whether to sort of hold back on that, as Tabucchi himself does. I can read one short passage here. Of course, it would help if I had my eyeglasses, which I conveniently forgot, that will show you something about the way in which he will combine the personal and the political in a story, make the personal political, as with the spy who discovers that his wife was betraying him. He does a wonderful job with that throughout these stories, but he also, as I was saying, he has a way of introducing a protagonist, and you're not clear exactly who the narrator of the story is going to be. There's a narrator who's then introduced by another person who ends up being the actual narrator. So we had to spend a lot of time talking about, okay, who's the actual narrator and who are the other narrators put into play by that actual narrator. So this is a story called Between Generals. It's about a Hungarian and a Russian general who encounter one another long after World War II, during which, of course, long after 1956, the invasion of Hungary, during which, of course, they were enemies. They don't see one another for a very long time. The Hungarians' reputation is rehabilitated after much goes on in history that I needn't summarize for you. From 56 onward, this Hungarian finds himself with ribbons and medals, and what he decides he wants to do is go to Moscow and talk to this Russian general. Now, all of that I just summarized for you is, thank you, Antonio, is given to us in this way. When the story begins, its protagonist was a young officer in the Hungarian army, and according to the Gregorian calendar, the year was 1956. For the sake of argument, we'll call him Laszlo, a name that renders him anonymous in Hungary, though truth be told, he wasn't just any Laszlo, he was that Laszlo. From a purely conjectural viewpoint, we might imagine him to be a man of around 35, tall, thin, reddish-blonde hair, gray eyes with a faint glint of blue. One might add that he was the sole heir of a family of landowners on the Romanian border, and in his household they spoke German more than Hungarian, according to Habsburg Empire tradition. After the expropriation of their land, the family moved to Budapest into a large apartment they were granted by the communist regime. And he goes on like this narrator, this invisible narrator, telling us about this man. Then he gets to a point where he says, A digression might be necessary that no longer belongs to the realm of conjecture, but to the imagination of the teller of a story as heard by somebody to whom the story was told in turn. Because we've already learned that this actual narrator, our invisible narrator, is not the one to whom the story was told. So we're getting a story filtered through at least one layer, and it turns out 2 layers, because there's yet another man who enters the story at the end to fill in the tag end of the man's life, the New York era. Our storyteller ends up moving to New York. So we have a complicated problem for the reader. The reader's trying to track, okay, who's my narrator? Who should I really trust? Who's confiding in whom here? And when am I going to be able to put all the pieces together? And as we were talking about Tabucchi before, sitting down here, I found myself just remembering that sensation I had of a great gift being given to me by a writer who was generous enough, imaginatively, and this speaks to what you're saying about feeling that you could have been a character in one of his stories. Tabucchi was generous enough imaginatively to really ask you as a reader to step in and play the role alternately of listener and of story maker, along with the narrator himself, to sort of participate deeply and fully in the making of the world as it is unfolding, and therefore to be subjected to this destabilizing sense of, whoa, what's up with time, and what are the emotional problems that these characters are facing over time as time works on them. Antonio, do you want to read a passage in Italian, maybe, just to give a little bit of a sense of the... do you want to go to that lovely one in Ioannis? We'll just give you just a paragraph so you can hear Tabucchi's Italian, which is lovely. The one that starts on the building's roof? You do read that. The one that starts on the building's flat roof?
Sulle pietre del lastrico era disegnata una rosa dei venti. Si fermò perplesso sulla direzione da prendere. L'orto botanico era grande e non ci sarebbe stato possibile trovare quello che cercava entro l'ora di chiusura. Scelse il mezzogiorno. In vita sua aveva cercato sempre il mezzogiorno e ora che era arrivato in quella città del sud gli pareva giusto continuare nella stessa direzione. Però dentro sentiva una brezza di tramontana. Pensò ai venti della vita, perché ci sono venti che accompagnano la vita. Lo zefiro soave, il vento caldo della gioventù che poi il maestrale si incarica di rinfrescare, certi libeci, lo scirocco che accascia, il vento gelido di tramontana. Aria, pensò, la vita è fatta d'aria, un soffio e via. E del resto anche noi non siamo nient'altro che un soffio, respiro, poi un giorno la macchina si ferma e il respiro finisce. Si fermò anche lui perché stava ansando. È un bel fiatone, si disse. Il sentiero faceva una salita rapida verso le terrazzate che si scorgevano oltre le ombre di magnolie giganti.
Okay, so I'll read the same passage. A compass rose was designed in the paving stones. He stopped, not sure which direction to take. The botanical garden was large, and he'd never find what he was seeking by closing time. He's under pressure, in other words, this narrator, to see something within a certain time. He chose south. In his life, he'd always looked south, and now that he'd arrived in this southern city, he thought it fitting to continue in the same direction. Yet, within, he felt a tramontana breeze. He thought of the winds in life, because there are winds that accompany life, the soft zephyr, the warm wind of youth that later the mistral takes upon itself to cool down. Certain southwesterly winds, the sirocco that weakens you, the icy mistral. Air, he thought. Life is made of air, a breath, and that's it. And after all, we too are nothing but a puff, a breath. And then one day the machine stops and that breath ends. He stopped too, because he was panting. You're really short of breath, he told himself. The path climbed steeply toward the terraced land he could just make out beyond the shadows of some enormous magnolias. And a little later in the same story, he asks himself, why did you come here? What are you looking for? it's all vanished. And often then something will intervene to sort of shake things up. And in this story it's a voice singing. In the first story it's the horses that appear. And you know, as Alexander said straight from the beginning, Tabucchi's imagination is such that he'll often just intervene, have in the story something intervene that startles you, that snaps you away from what you think is happening or should be happening to these characters, and allows for a whole other possibility. And that sort of gets to that last paragraph, maybe, of the final story. That,
oh, okay.
Yeah, that we should
Can I
read.
say something about that?
Yeah.
Before reading the last paragraph, which I think is the core of the Tabucchi's thought, I'd like to say a few seconds something about my personal relationship with him, because I met him 3 times actually. In the mid-90s, I was at a bookstore, so I invited him to present Sostine Pereira, Pereira de Cleos.
A wonderful novel, by the way, for those who haven't known.
A fundamental novel for the Italians in that period. The protagonist is a normal man, not particularly interested in politics, but with strong and unforgettable ethical principles. And his reaction to what's happening in Portugal in that period, where the story is placed, is the reaction of a normal man who can't accept that some basic fundamental principles are established. And this is the reason I loved Tabucchi since the beginning, and I felt so honored when Gilles offered us this chance, because that's the highest satisfaction for me, for us, because this translation is, for me, is as a tribute to his humanity and kind of strength, because to his way of considering literature and politics too. There is a quotation at the beginning of the book. He chooses from a pre-Socratic philosopher, Chrétien, and it says, in Italian says, inseguendo l'ombra, il tempo invecchia in fretta. He took the second part for the title of the book, Times Ages in a Hurry. But the first part means, we translated after the shadow. In Italian, inseguendo means something more, in particular, but maybe I'm giving this meaning. When you follow something that is not worth following, which is the simple way to express his unsatisfaction about how society was developing in Italy, but not only in Italy, in that period, in the 90s, late 80s. He was interested in let's say, simplifying, two things. What it's called the disquiet. Not by chance he translated a great book by Pessoa, and actually I don't know if he translated it. Well, yeah, I guess he loved this book. And then he was interested in time, and he used to say that an artist, a writer, most of the time is not on the same phase with society and history. Is separated in some ways. Is a little bit too late or too early. And this is the space for literature, for art, where the writer, in this case, can try to discover some hidden corners that are kind of abandoned or forgotten. And this is the role of the artist to keep take to surface what could be forgotten or not understood. So, and at that point, literature can be really, or any kind of art, but literature in this case, can be a means of freedom, to conquer the freedom of thinking in a way that is not the way that the predominant power wants us to think of. So, and I wanted to say this because Tabucchi, for me, but for many Italians, was a model, particularly in years when Italy was, and it still is, kind of reduced to vulgarity and stereotype or stupidity, kitsch, whatever you can find, far away from the pure classical idea of Italy as the place where beauty and harmony and happiness can possibly find a place. So now,
if I can just add a little something here about what you've said, I think it's important to remember that our experience in reading this, that we had also the tenderness that's in this book too.
Okay.
I mean, we've dwelled, the three of us really, in talking about him, we've dwelled a bit on the way he works political truth and reality and complication into these stories of human lives. But there's also a real tenderness. I'm thinking about the story of the soldier who's dying, not soldier, the ex-military man who's dying on a beach. He's been exposed to radiation. This is basically...
After Bosnia's...
yes.
war.
These stories are set, by the way, in various periods in various countries. So, Bosnia, Romania, Israel, Switzerland. I mean, you travel a lot in these stories. You travel in time, you travel in historical moment. This man is clearly dying. He encounters a girl, a young girl on the beach, and they have this conversation that's equal parts comic and tender. She's clearly having her own hard time, and he slowly susses out what her problem is. And they have this unexpected dialogue that ends with him teaching her how to read clouds. And this too, of course, the cloud is nothing if not a wonderful symbol for the ephemeral nature of reality, the passage of time, the way in which if you're reading a cloud, you have to be quick and construct what it might mean and then let it go and then do it again. That's again, the tipping of the hat to the reader saying, you come, you do this too, you be part of this too. So I just felt it was important for us not to lose that thread as well.
Another moment like that is where, I guess it's in the second story, where he's remembering a game that they played called What If?
Yeah.
Where on rainy days in his childhood, his uncle would play this thing where he'd say, well, I know that I have the passage in front of me, but what if we went to the moon and no one was there? And what if the ship didn't take off, and what if you keep sort of doing various what ifs within complicating the initial premise and having an imaginative game, and that in a sense you might say is a little bit of a metaphor for the way he works as a fiction writer, where he's posing a series of what ifs, and you as the reader are then answering those questions in your own different way, that thing where he creates imaginative spaces for the reader that you then occupy. So I find often when reading Tabucchi, I find myself sometimes confused between, did I read that, or did I remember that, or did I imagine that? There are a lot of those kind of moments where he has that effect on you. That was kind of what I was trying to get at the beginning, when I was saying he's a reader who can affect the way in which you perceive reality, which I think is one of his great strengths. He does enter into your head and begins to play with your perceptions in the way that certain writers do, particularly the writers that he admire, and especially Pessoa, Pirandello, and others.
In this case, for instance, he was quoting Rimbaud, because there was a poem, Tique. So he has also his own way of, it's a subtle way, not, I say, to refer to a lot of great writers in a way that is not
he slips it in. We would often, as translators, have this experience of, wait, did we read that? Where did we read that? What did I imagine that? Did you say that? You know, it could sometimes get
self-irony, for instance, just talking about the character who is back painting, and clearly refers to himself. And at a certain point, he has a series of indirect, not immediately clear quotation by other writers, and at a certain point he says, referring to his spine, he says colonna infame, which now to a non-Italian reader, maybe it doesn't say anything, but colonna infame is a famous little book that Alessandro Manzoni, the big 19th century writer, Italian writer, wrote about torture in 17th century, and we had some translation problems.
It's here. Dialogue was impossible. He stretched it very carefully, and the pain concentrated in his spinal column, the column of infamy. We translated it more or less literally, not knowing that we couldn't. He grew irritated again. He thought that if he called the doctor, who at this point he was all too familiar with, he'd tell him he was suffering from literature, an observation already made in the past. He pictured the doctor saying, "My dear fellow, the problem is mainly due to the fact that you assume the wrong positions. Actually, you've assumed the wrong positions all your life. To write, because the problem, unfortunately, is that you write. Don't be offended. Instead of leading a life more consonant with hygiene and well-being, that is, going to a pool or jogging around in shorts like other men your age, you stay all bent over writing your books for whole days at a time. And not only bent over, I've seen you, you're all crooked too, like a misshapen biscuit. Your spine looks like the sea when a southwest wind blows, all crooked. But it's too late to reform it now. You could try torturing it a bit less. You don't seem capable of reading the x-rays I brought you. So to make you really understand, tomorrow I'll bring you the plastic articulated spine I used to study with at college, and I'll shape it like yours, so you'll finally see what you're reduced to."
So I have to read that passage.
Should we not maybe open to some questions now in light of the time? Yes, Martha.
Hi. It's sort of a basic question, which is, he is not widely translated. Are you guys his translators here, or?
We are among his translators.
Among them, yes.
There have been several. Jill maybe could answer.
Tim Parks has done quite a bit. Tim Parks, good in Melbourne.
Yes, as someone who doesn't know, I'm just wondering how widely translated, how many of his books are available.
Probably about a handful. Yeah.
It's
New Directions published a lot, and in the UK, there's some that didn't make it over. What happened in that weekend?
It's about 7. About 7, but your question is important. I'm a great proselytizer. I assign these books in classes that I teach. I'm always telling people about Rare Declares. I think I recommended it to you years ago. You know, it's just, he's one of these authors that should be on everyone's map, I think, and should have been a long time ago, but somehow, despite the fact that these books do exist and are in print, he hasn't gotten, I don't feel, and I can tell you, some of you might agree, the notice that he deserves. I think he's been a real game changer in a lot of ways in the short story form. I don't see American short story writers making work like this. I don't see the mix of that breathlessness of the prose, the straddling of the real and the imaginary, and the intensely fruitful way of dealing with political reality that never gets preachy, is always very light in the Calvino sense of the word. I don't know anyone else who's doing that. I could be wrong.
Did you ever translate him?
No, I've not translated in general. I find it hard enough to do my own work without having that on top of it. But
He could tell a lot about his experience with the Italian society and politics too, but I don't know if he wants.
it's happened a long time.
You've spoken about Pessoa. Is there any other transmission of Portuguese literature that appears in his work?
I think it's just sort of in the feeling. Pessoa was enormously important to him, and he taught him, as I mentioned, he was a professor of Portuguese literature. He did a beautiful translation. In fact, actually, I had a rather Tabucchi and Pessoan moment the other day. I was clearing out a house where I kept thousands of books up in Massachusetts, and I had it very much in mind that I wanted to salvage out of the thousands of books in this house, among the hundreds that I was going to be able to keep, my copy in the Delphi edition of Tabucchi's translation of Pessoa. To my surprise, it was not where I thought it was. I couldn't find it anywhere. Who in the world would take from a house in western Massachusetts, been rented many times, translation of a Portuguese poem into Italian? But it effectively wasn't there, and so I felt the loss of this book a little bit like the loss of Antonio, but it somewhere is out there. But Pessoa is also a writer who has not had as much life in English as he has in some other languages. But Tabucchi's translation of it was extraordinary. His introduction in that particular volume was exceptionally good. But I think it's just, I mean, what you see in a lot of Antonio's work that clearly was part of his love of Pessoa. Pessoa, for those of you who haven't encountered him, was this very singular, eccentric Portuguese writer who led a rather quiet, anonymous life as a kind of office clerk. He had a very active literary life and imagination in which he invented a series of literary characters. He wrote under many different names. He conducted literary debates in Portuguese journals between his different characters. So one would be a classical poet, and the other a fervent modernist, and the third a surrealist, and they would go at each other and publish simultaneously in these journals. So this, I think, made a great impression on Antonio, who saw, I think, in a lot of Antonio's work, the self is a very fragile and complex entity that can be reconfigured and reimagined. And that is clearly much related to his relationship with Pessoa and his work.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think the complex structure of these short stories, different narrators respond to Tabucchi's need of acting and feeling and thinking as another person. He theorized this. This is the gift, he said, of literature. we can be different persons and find different point of views and different stories. So it was interested in this complicated interactive
Stuck between languages.
Yeah.
Seen it happen a lot.
Yeah, okay, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I have a question. I hope it's not too personal, but since, like, when I do translation, I work alone. It's a very lonely process, I guess. I'm wondering about the dynamic of working together. And I'm also wondering about the dynamic between the two languages that happens when you're both so proficient in your own language, especially the fact that an Italian will often bring immense semantic intensity to a word, like what you were saying with inseguire. You know, I had no idea that it sort of meant just to sort of line up, you know, that it had this sort of idea of following something. But I mean, and then a kind of dissatisfaction that they'll have that you, as an English translator, will propose. You'll say this, no, it's not that, no, it's not that, no, it's not that. And this sort of tug of war that has to go on between the two.
We spent hours doing that.
Well, first of all, let me say this, that co-translating sometimes could be kind of stressing, but yeah, when you live with somebody, that's, maybe it's a way of changing channel. I don't know. But what I found, and for me was a really new experience, trying to translate is challenging because I have to read in a different way the Italian too. It's a deeper way of reading the Italian, and I discover a lot of meaning that under her stimulation, she wants to know how it sounds to your ear, and when you read without having the hustle of explaining or describing your experience, maybe you don't even realize that. So that was a great experience for me.
The thing about translation is, of course, it's not just a matter of carrying literal meanings or even stepping beyond that of interpretation. There's also a whole question of context, of cultural context, and that's where it was invaluable to have someone right there who could fill me in on history, fill me in on particular questions I had attending these stories, matters of political reality, for example. So a lot of it was that, it was just context building. And then, but it went in both directions too, because when it comes to the word and what's charged or loaded in a word or a phrase in one language and what you do in another, we just spent a lot of time trying to explain to each other how something sounds, lands, feels in the other language, trying to just step by step get closer and closer to what's going to be the realm of possibilities for the translation moment, whatever it may be. I'm looking at two wonderful translators right here, and I can see them both sort of, you know, there's many wheels spinning amongst translators when these questions come up. I think you both work chiefly alone, right? Yeah, and we've never worked except as a couple. And
Well, I thought you were talking about people behind us.
I would say, you know, there's a sort of eros to translation, whether one does it singly or in couple. It becomes a different eros when it's in couple. There's a sort of dance.
It's better in couple, actually.
Woody Allen has a joke about that, if you do it by yourself.
Maybe I shouldn't go down too far down this path, but I guess some metaphor that comes to me is just a sort of dance one has to do either in one's own mind or with someone else. And it does start with sound. It always starts with sound. I mean, we do a lot of reading to each other at the beginning. We begin by translating a poet, Jean-Pierre Romani, and that required a lot of context building, and that required a lot of work thinking about form. This was a different challenge.
in the same vein, what happens when you disagree?
It's not pretty.
Who won?
I'm a pacifist.
There.
No, no,
But
really,
I don't
how did
forget.
you decide who was more correct?
We did a lot of revisiting, a lot, days would go by, wait, can we go back to that? That became a constant phrase in our house, like, can we go back, can we look at that again? There was just a lot of revisiting. I mean, in the end, when you're working, Antonio's not fluent in English, and I'm not fluent in Italian. We're both fluent in each other's language, but we don't pretend to be fluent in each other's language. It would be ridiculous for us to assert that. And so the real pleasure came in the sort of mutual instruction and mutual engagement. And I think there are things that we were able to accomplish and do as translators that would be harder for a sole translator to do, just take longer, if nothing else. But there were things that, we had to sort of be wary of, just knowing each other as well as we do and knowing each other's language patterns as well as we do. We had to sort of be careful not to be unconsciously kind of reinforcing something between the two of us that might not actually be right or true for the work at hand. So whether you're working alone or in couple, there's just things you have to be mindful of, where your limits are, where you need help, where you need an outsider to step in.
And then, I mean, translation is always, you have to make choices.
Yeah, in the
Every
end.
word, and so it's a kind of democratic challenge instead of being alone.
Okay, one more?
Well, on that same, because I was going to basically ask what Michael asked, but put it in a different way, which was sort of, is it good or bad for a marriage to be translated? But the other thing really is that there's 3 people, even at once. So I was wondering, Antonio, if you went back to previous works of Tabucchi, and if Martha, if you talked that you said, I think, that there were 7 volumes of various things in translation. Did you try to have a different sense of this third person in between you, whose work you were concentrating on? Did you extend it beyond the stories in terms of just context and his sensibility generally?
I certainly looked at other translations just to see how, in particular, the problem of the peculiarity of syntax and the length of sentences was handled. But I didn't spend too much time. It's sort of anxiety of influence too. You want to bring your own stamp, your own freshness to it. Antonio reread. You reread some of his work, of course.
Basically.
And interviews. You read interviews.
Interviews with Jennifer.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting experience for me because I think in this book particularly, I found what I was thinking of Tabucchi. A simple person with a very, very complicated imagination and able to transfer in words, in the structure of the sentence and the paragraph, the inexplicable connections that he would like to show. So what my main role in the co-translation was actually to try to transfer and make her feel what I was feeling when I was reading the text.
What you discovered.
Yeah, a lot of
Yeah.
it was what he discovered, which changed as the reading went.
3 seconds, so I read this because I will and then you can read it in English. But if you because it's important as a conclusion also. Tutto cambiò di prospettiva. In un lampo provò l'ebbrezza della scoperta, una sottile nausea e una mortale malinconia, ma anche un senso di liberazione infinito, come quando finalmente capiamo qualcosa che sapevamo da sempre e non volevamo sapere. Non era il già visto che lo inghiottiva in un passato mai vissuto, era lui che lo stava catturando in un futuro ancora da vivere.
I will read this in English, but I would like to say, just by way of conclusion, first I'd like to thank Alexander deeply for taking time and energy to read the book and be with us. I'd like to thank Sheridan Hay and everyone at the center who invited us here, and all of you for coming. And of course Jill for giving us the opportunity to carry Tabucchi into this Tabucchi. So here's the passage. Everything changed perspective. In a flash he felt the euphoria of discovery, a subtle nausea, a mortal melancholy, but also a sense of infinite liberation, as when we finally understand something we'd known all along and didn't want to know. It wasn't the already seen that was swallowing him in a never-lived past. He instead was capturing it in a future yet to be lived. Thank you very much.